So now we move on to talk about the theory of production and costs. In the last unit, we were really focused on the individual. What does the person want? What does the individual consumer want? What do you want? What does Hush Puppy want? Um, but now we're going to be focused on how firms make their decisions and how companies make decisions about how much to produce and how they balance it off to with the costs of production. In America, there are 30 million businesses. How do they decide what to produce? And then how do they decide how much to sell it for? So in this theory of production and costs unit, we'll be talking about the resources used in production. That's pretty basic. We'll be running through some definitions because, as you know, economists are very odd and they define most words differently from how accountants define the words and how other business people define words. So we're going to go through that. We're going to go through the neoclassical theory of production and costs, and you might see some similarities between the neoclassical theory of production and costs and the neoclassical theory of consumption that we looked at in the last unit. We'll also look at its limitations. Then we'll go on to the hard part, which is lots of graphs and lots of equations, looking at simple production and cost functions. And then we'll go into what the short run and long run decision making modeling is for production. We'll also be looking at how to derive an upward sloping supply curve, and we'll be looking at increasing constant and decreasing returns, marginal costs, and returns to scale. Briefly, I'll talk about airlines and how these dynamics apply to airlines and how it applies to small savers as well. So it's a pretty heavy module. I warn you, there are lots of graphs, but it's also quite interesting. And one of my friends in Nigeria, one of my girlfriends from social media, also makes an appearance here. So I'll be glad to talk about her business as well. So, what are the factors of production? I'm sure people do know the factors of production already: natural land, labor, enterprise, and capital. And then we'll go into the definitions. So one big definition that you need to know about is the definition of stocks, the quantity of something at any particular point in time. Whereas flows can be goods or services measured over periods of time. And while stocks can only be goods, flows can be goods or services. The third definition, which is a bit different from the normal business or accounting definition, is capital. Capital refers to the material objects necessary for production. So they can be machines, they can be factory space, they can be tools. All of these things are types of capital. In the economic definition of capital, even like know-how, even this course that we're taking can be a type of capital. So the economists see capital as a much wider concept than, I guess, accountants or bankers see it. And economists recognize natural capital, manufactured capital, financial capital, human capital, and social capital. In the short run, economists assume that the level of capital is fixed. So firms can't sell machinery the moment it's no longer needed, neither can they build a new factory and start producing goods there immediately. When looking at the production function, therefore, as we'll be doing in the next few slides in the short run, capital will be a constant rather than a variable. And I just mentioned this on the first slide for of definitions to get your mind prepared for when we really dig into these concepts of production function and short run and long run, but we'll be studying a lot more in the subsequent slides. So before we go into that, we have to have a look at the neoclassical view of production. And the neoclassical view is kind of similar to the neoclassical view of consumption, the neoclassical view of production. You'll see some similarities in the fact that it's rather unemotional and very black and white in terms of its approach. So the neoclassical view of production is that every firm acts in a way that will maximize profit. And that profit, the simple definition of profit, is revenue minus cost. And the way to maximize profit is through efficient production. And production is the way that firms take bundles of inputs and turn them into outputs. A neoclassical view views firms as profit maximizers. So firms will maximize profits. So they maximize profits when the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. In the short run, that's a period of time when at least one of these inputs is variable. Firms are subject to diminishing returns, and that's a concept that I'll explain a bit later in this video as well. The neoclassical view also believes that prices are flexible. So if there's a shortage of goods, the price mechanism will lead to higher prices. There's also an assumption that many markets are competitive and close to the model of perfect competition. Therefore, prices will be determined by competitive factors. Firms employ labor like any other factor of production. Therefore, wages and quantity of labor are determined by the marginal revenue product theory. Neoclassical economics also assumes that wages are flexible. For example, if there's a fall in demand for workers, this will lead to a fall in wages to maintain equilibrium. So as you can see, the neoclassical view is very sort of black and white. This is about demand and supply. This is about the fundamentals, and it doesn't really take into consideration other factors. So the assumptions required for the neoclassical model are there's perfect information, there's a perfect market in terms of competition, and that there are no transaction costs. But there are quite a few criticisms of the neoclassical theory of firms. So the first criticism is that firms often seek to maximize the size of the firm and market share rather than profit. So if you think of our boy Jeff Bezos, he was looking for market share, right? He was actually loss making for a very, very long time, and he wanted to like dominate the market and take all the market share and maximize, make this massive firm. Firms sometimes can act in a way that isn't profit maximizing. The second criticism is what's called profit satisficing. And this is a perspective that firms have a principal agent problem. So the owners of the firm may wish to maximize profits, but their workers don't. And therefore, a compromise needs to be reached, where the workers do enough to keep the owners happy, but then pursue other objectives, such as enjoying themselves, having a laugh at work. And this problem is known as the separation of ownership and control. I've put our daughter, Greta, here because there are companies that have other objectives. It's not just about profit for them. They want to preserve the state of the environment, or they have cultural or social objectives. This criticism says that human beings just aren't profit maximizers, but may have other non-financial objectives for being in business as well. And I'm sure if Greta was to start a business, it wouldn't be about profit. It would be about climate change, or perhaps preserving our environment, preserving our world. Also, if you remember the last slide, it indicated that wages, the primary determinant of wages is the primary determinant of a wage is the force of demand and supply, and those are the forces that control wages. But they may not actually be that flexible. For example, unions may resist wage cuts. Labor can't always be treated like a commodity. You can't really say that, human labor is the same as, inanimate capital. This ignores human psychology of workers getting frustrated or demotivated. Behavioral economics actually suggests that there are a range of factors that can determine business and consumer behavior other than utility maximization theory. Firms might want to become more prestigious, and they might want to take risks for non-economic reasons, or they might just want to avoid losing what they already have. So these are some of the criticisms of the neoclassical theory of firms that introduces a few shades of grey to the black and white picture that I perhaps painted in the last slide and the slide before that. Now we move on to the meat of the module, which is production function. And I've put a picture of one of our female industrialists in Nigeria, Mira. And I'm going to be talking a bit about Mira's business because she produces tomato paste. And I'm going to be using tomato paste in some of the examples in the coming slides. But first I'll introduce the idea of production function. So firms use production function to determine how much output they should produce given the price of a good. So the production function is what Mira is going to be using to determine how much tomato paste she should produce based around the price that she can sell tomato paste in the market. It's also used to find out what combination of inputs they should use to produce their products given the price of capital and the price of labor. When firms are deciding how much to produce, they typically find that at high levels of production, their marginal costs begin increasing. So there's a point that it comes to that, they're overproducing, and, all the gains that they get from volume start to go down. And this is called diminishing returns to scale, whereas increasing the quantity of inputs creates a less than proportional increase in the quantity of output. If it weren't for diminishing returns to scale, supply could just expand without limits and without increasing the cost of a good. So Mira could just, supply and just use the whole of Nigeria to plant tomatoes and make unlimited amounts of tomato paste. But she's not going to do that. She's going to use a production function to try and figure out how much output she should produce given the price and what combination of inputs she should use. So let's get into it. So first of all, some assumptions and a big idea. So the assumptions in most of the analysis on production function is that we assume that firms only use two types of inputs, capital and labor, and output is a function of a combination of capital and labor. There's also an important distinction between variable cost. Those are the costs that can be changed in a short space of time, and fixed costs. Those are the costs that can't be changed in a short space of time. And a combination of fixed cost and total variable cost equal the total cost. So in Mira's example, the number of lady smallholder farmers that she employs or she works with can maybe quite easily change. However, she can't build a new factory in like a week, right? So the cost of building a factory to Mira is probably one of her fixed costs, whereas, labor perhaps is more variable. So there are two major concepts that are probably the most important concepts in this unit, which are the cost function and the production function. The production function shows a relationship between the input used and the output produced. So for Mira, her production function is a relationship between the raw tomatoes from her farm and the amount of tomato paste produced. and it's used for measuring efficiency of the factors that are used in the production process. So those of you that have followed Mira's story remember that she started with actually quite low yields for the seeds that she used to grow the tomatoes, but she's managed to increase yields over time very significantly. So her production function has changed, and the efficiency with which she uses capital and labor have improved. The second is the cost function, and that shows the relationship between the price of inputs and the quantity produced. And that includes the total cost, total fixed cost, total variable cost, average total cost, average fixed cost, and average variable cost. And don't worry, I'll be defining them all on the next slide. But the cost function is actually the most complex bit of calculation in this unit, where you have to know the relationships between all of these different elements of cost. And the connection between the production function and the cost function is that the cost function is actually derived from the production function. So if you look at the graphs, you can see the production curve and the production function and the cost curves. The cost curves are very famous. You need to know this graph. So the cost and production function could be related through the curves of total production and total cost. Initially, as you can see, the total cost is actually higher compared to the total product because of the higher fixed costs. So when Mira first builds her factory and she's producing relatively low amounts of tomato paste, then of course she has higher cost compared to the total product, because the cost of the building the factory is still there, it's still the same. And whether you're producing does tomato paste come in cans? I guess tubes. I think it comes in tubes or sachets. Whether you're producing one sachet of tomato paste or whether you're producing 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 sachets of tomato paste, you still have the cost of the factory. So initially, the total cost is higher compared to the total product because of the higher fixed cost. But in the long run, the increase in output surpasses an increase in cost. However, when production enters a stage of diminishing returns to scale, the total variable cost increases more than the increase in production of output. So Mira starts off, producing one sachet in her expensive factory, and then she goes up to 1,000, then she goes up to 10,000, then she has to keep on employing people, and that's the variable part of the cost. It gets to a point that there's just too many people in the factory and it becomes really inefficient, and they start bumping into each other, and there's no space for people to move in the factory, and it just becomes chaotic, and that's when it enters a phase of diminishing returns to scale. So as you can see, it's a U-shaped graph where it starts really expensive, it goes down to the perfect most efficient way of producing tomato paste, and then it goes back up as it becomes more inefficient. So the MC and AVC cross at the most efficient cost per unit. Now, in terms of cost curves in the short run, both the marginal cost and the average cost are U-shaped, first due to increasing and then diminishing returns. Average cost begins to increase where it intersects with the marginal cost curve. So once you understand this, then you have a good understanding of your production curves and your cost curves. Now, the definitions of all of those things that I mentioned on the last slide. Total cost. So total cost, as I explained, equals to total fixed cost plus total variable costs. Variable costs is the cost paid to variable inputs like labor, capital, materials, power, land, buildings. Variable input is traditionally assumed to be labor. Total variable cost is the same as variable cost. Fixed cost is the cost of fixed assets, those that don't vary with production, like Mira's factory. Total fixed cost, of course, is the same as fixed cost. Average fixed cost is the fixed cost divided by the output. That's TFC, total fixed cost, over Q, which is quantity. The average variable cost is the variable cost divided by the output. And the average variable cost curve is usually U-shaped, and it lies below the average cost curve. The marginal cost is the change in total cost when the quantity produced changes by 1 unit. So the marginal cost is the cost between Mira producing 112 and that extra cost to produce the 113th sachet of tomato paste. Cost curves are a graph of the cost of production as a function of the total quantity produced. So in a free market economy, firms use cost curves to find the optimal point of production to minimize cost. Maximizing firms use the curves to decide output quantities to achieve production goals. One more concept that you have to learn after that whole brain full of different terms and graphs is the short run versus the long run, which is relatively easier. So the long run is a period over which some of the inputs are fixed. The short run is the period over which some of the inputs are fixed, and the long run is a period over which all inputs are variable. So in the short run, firms make SR decisions by looking at the marginal cost of labor, which is the change in total output from one additional unit of labor, one additional person coming into the factory. How much does output change? So assuming that labor is variable but capital is fixed, the reason why each worker does less at some point is because they all have the same stuff to work with. So they all have the same sort of machines, the same size of factory, and at some point 10 people working on the same machine just becomes really inefficient. In the long run, all inputs are variable, and then it's a trade-off between labor and capital. The last graph of this module, thank God I can hear everybody's sighs of relief, is the short run supply curve. So in a perfectly competitive market, the short run supply curve is the marginal cost curve at and above the shutdown point. The proportions of the marginal cost curve below the shutdown point are no part of the supply curve because the firm isn't producing in that range. So the short run supply curve is used to graph a firm's short run economic states. Now the long run supply curve of a market is the sum of a series of that market's short run supply curves. Most supply curves are composed of 3 periods, like I described, which is a period of increasing returns to scale, where adding more and more workers increases the productivity. Then you go through a period of constant returns to scale, and then you go through a period of decreasing returns to scale. So a long run supply curve connects a point of constant returns to scales of a market's short run supply curves. So I just want to define all of these terms because it's one of the common questions that come up. What do we mean when we say constant returns to scale? What do we mean when we say decreasing returns to scale? What do we mean when we say increasing returns to scale? So constant returns to scale are changes in the output resulting from a proportional change in all inputs. So that means that a change of 2, say, as a random number in output gives you a change. If you double the input, you double the output. Decreasing returns to scale means changes in output resulting from a proportional change in inputs. if output increases by a less than proportional change, then there are decreasing returns in scale to scale. So that's a horrible situation, right? Where you actually increase the inputs, but the output decreases. So that's a situation that you really don't want to be in. And then there are increasing returns to scale, where output increases by even more than the proportional return increase in inputs. So you increase the inputs, double the inputs, for instance, and you get like 6 times the output. So that's the increasing returns to scale. Finally, I have to talk about isoquants. So isoquants are like the indifference curves in the consumer module. An isoquant is a curve that shows all of the possible combinations of inputs that yield the same level of outputs. And the straight line and the right angle line are extreme scenarios. So a straight line would mean that you have like perfect substitutes, and a right angle would mean that you have perfect complements. So I'll give an example of perfect substitutes. Like a perfect substitute would be Mira again deciding to use 2 different sets of tomato seeds that give exactly the same result in terms of yield. And you know, I don't know anything about agriculture, but I don't really think perhaps that that's a realistic scenario. There are good quality seeds and bad quality seeds, so it's very rare that you find like perfect substitutes where, you know, getting seeds, let's say from, you know, a supplier in Benue State will be exactly the same as getting the seeds from like a super genetically modified tomato seed lab in the Netherlands. And then there can also be perfect, so that represents perfect substitutes. And then perfect complements would be where, you know, the right angle, where they don't complement each other at all. So when both inputs are perfect complements, so perfect substitutes, sorry, the isoquant is a straight line and can have a constant slope because one input can be replaced with the other at the same rate. Similarly, the right angle is when no substitution is possible. So let's say cocoa beans, for instance. There's no way that cocoa beans will produce tomato paste for Mira. So you can't substitute cocoa beans for the tomatoes, tomato seeds, if you want to make tomato paste. So when no substitution is possible at all, the isoquants take a shape of a right angle, which means that a fixed proportion must be maintained at all points, must be maintained between the 2 inputs. Curved isoquants, like the one in the picture, are the most typical, and that represents inputs that are neither perfect substitutes or perfect complements. They're convex in shape, which means that they are steeper near the y-axis and get flatter as they reach the x-axis. So I'm going to talk about 2 major inefficiencies that can occur in any market and skew the market. One is called path dependence and one is called the network externality effect. So path dependence is when something starts out a certain way and then people just keep on doing it. So the history of the QWERTY keyboard, why it's not arranged in alphabet order, it's arranged in this, you know, weird thing that we've just gotten used to, is because, you know, when typewriters were invented, apparently it was that distribution that stopped the keys from jamming when people were typing. Obviously that's not an issue anymore, but we still make keyboards that way just because we've always done it that way, and now everybody has gotten into the habit. So when history has an overbearing influence, that's called path dependence. And that kind of skews the market, right? Because you're not doing the most efficient thing. You're just doing, you know, a historical relic. And then the second set of inefficiencies that can occur in the market are network externalities, where everybody has something. And because everybody buys it, more people buy it. And it might not necessarily be the best product in the market, but now like all your friends are on it and everybody else is on it and every business is using it. You can't not use it because you have to communicate with those people. So when everybody else is using a particular product, it creates a feedback loop, like Windows, for instance, where everybody still has to continue using that product, even though, again, it might not be the most efficient thing. So I'm just going to talk about airlines and small saver accounts. Very briefly, hopefully I can get this down to 30 seconds and finish the unit, and talk about how some of these things affect us in a practical way. So the first practical example was with Mira and her tomato paste producing factory. And airlines have a similar sort of story. They're high, very, very high fixed cost, and actually, in terms of buying the machines, maintaining the machines, these are all fixed costs, right? And then they have to fill them up. That's a variable, sort of the utilization, and the output can vary depending on how many tickets that they sell. And then with small saver accounts, actually, people that don't keep that much money in their accounts and people that want to save, it actually isn't profitable for many microfinance banks to be able to do that. Just keep tiny amounts of money because of the administration and all the overheads that go into just keeping these tiny amounts of money and looking after these tiny customers. But there are actually other services that they can cross-subsidize to make it more profitable. So the fixed cost of small savers accounts is actually higher than, is higher than the cost of looking after those customers. But they found ways that they can cross subsidize by giving those people loans and other financial services to make it a bit more worthwhile.